He banished her from his court because the law said she was nothing. An omega was never meant to stand near a throne or a war. But when alliances turned to betrayal and the kingdom began to fall, the Alpha King learned strength doesn't always roar from power. Alone on a battlefield, with death closing in, the wolf he cast aside returned from the shadows. She did not come for forgiveness. She came to decide who deserved to survive. At the center of that order sat King Riven Vale, the Alpha whose name alone could still a room. He did not rule by warmth or promises. He ruled by precision. Years of border conflict had shaped him into something controlled and unyielding, the kind of leader who could endure loss without blinking and make decisions that left others shaken but kept the territory standing. His presence was deliberate, shoulders squared, gaze steady, expression carved into calm authority. Even when the council pressed him, even when nobles argued, he did not lean into anger. He did not need to. The court had learned that when Riven spoke, he had already decided, and the world would rearrange itself around his will. But discipline had a cost, and the court paid it in small, invisible ways. They feared him, respected him, and watched him for cracks they never found. He did not laugh easily. He did not indulge sentiment. He treated emotions like weather, something that might arrive, might pass, but never something to build a kingdom upon. The elders praised it, calling it strength. The nobles admired it, calling it leadership. Yet beneath their praise sat a constant hunger for spectacle, for proof that the Alpha King's perfection could survive every challenge, every rumor, every inconvenient truth. That was why her existence became a problem. Her name was Lyra Ashen. The court called her Omega the way one might name a burden, a category, an embarrassment that should remain behind doors. She moved through the lower halls with her head inclined, hands steady, eyes careful not to meet the wrong gaze for too long. On the surface she looked like what Varen demanded an Omega to be, quiet, obedient, useful only in the smallest ways. She carried water for elders, sorted herbs for healers, cleaned ceremonial cloths no one else would touch. She accepted orders with a nod and left without complaint. Yet something about her unsettled the court in a way they could not easily explain. It was not arrogance. It was not defiance. It was the calm in her silence, the way she never flinched when others tried to make her smaller. It was the strange steadiness in her eyes, as if she was listening to something deeper than the voices around her. When she passed, certain wolves felt their own instincts stir, confused and irritated by a presence that should have been beneath notice. Sometimes, when shadows gathered wrong in a corridor, a guard would catch a glimpse of her reflection and swear her pupils had flashed gold for half a heartbeat. Lyra did not speak of it. She did not understand it fully herself, only that something lived under her skin like a sleeping storm. Her wolf did not behave like an Omega's wolf should. It did not cower. It did not shrink. It stayed quiet, yes, but not from weakness. It stayed quiet like a blade kept hidden until the right moment. In the deepest part of her, it watched, remembering instincts she had never been taught, holding strength she had never been allowed to claim. Lyra had survived by making herself forget it most days, because remembering made her dangerous in a court that punished anything it could not label. Riven noticed her the way he noticed every irregularity. He did not see her first as a woman, or even as an Omega. He saw her as a disruption. The nobles whispered about her origins. The elders called her presence an insult to the purity of Alpha lineage. A few even suggested she was a bad omen, an imperfect thread in a tapestry the court wanted spotless. Every time a visiting dignitary stepped into the hall and saw an Omega working too close to the throne, someone's pride tightened like a fist. The court had enemies beyond its borders, but it also had enemies within its own vanity, and vanity demanded easy targets. Pressure gathered quietly, day after day, until it formed a polished argument dressed as necessity. The council began bringing Lyra's name into meetings that had nothing to do with her. They framed it as optics, as tradition, as protecting the court's image. They warned that rival pacts would call Varen weak if it tolerated an Omega too near the royal circle. They spoke of stability, of loyalty, of a future built on unquestioned hierarchy. They did not say what they meant outright. They wanted to erase the discomfort she caused, because discomfort made him feel less powerful. Riven listened without reacting, but the tension did not leave his shoulders. He was not blind to politics. He knew image mattered because war did not always begin with swords. Sometimes it began with perception. A court that looked uncertain invited challenge. A king who hesitated invited rebellion. He told himself he was protecting Varen from cracks others might exploit. He told himself he was doing what a ruler must do, choose the whole over the individual, order over exception. And still, when his eyes landed on Lyra one evening as she stood near the edge of the great hall, something in him paused. She was not doing anything wrong. She was simply there, steady as stone, accepting her place without pleading for more. That should have made her invisible. Instead, it made her impossible to ignore. The judgment came without drama, because the court preferred cruelty delivered cleanly. On the day of the decree, the hall was full. Elders sat in their carved seats, nobles lined the sides, guards stood like statues. Lyra was summoned and brought forward with the same formal coldness the court used for ceremonies. She knelt because she was expected to. She kept her breathing even because panic would only entertain them. Her hands were folded in front of her, fingers calm despite the tremor trying to rise in her chest. Riven did not descend from the throne. He did not soften his posture. His voice carried through the hall like iron laid across stone. He spoke of tradition, of stability, of the need for the court to remain unchallenged in perception and structure. He did not accuse her of wrongdoing. He did not call her a threat. That would have been too honest and too intimate. Instead, he framed it as an unavoidable correction. And Omega did not belong in the heart of Varen's court. The borderlands would be better suited for her station. It was not exile, he said. It was placement. It was mercy, he implied, because it spared her from the scrutiny and cruelty that would grow if she stayed. Lyra lifted her gaze only once, just enough to meet his eyes for a single breath of time. In that moment, she understood the true wound was not the banishment. The wound was that he believed this was mercy. That he believed removing her was kindness. That he could make a decision about her life without ever truly seeing her. She did not beg. She did not argue. She did not break in the way the court seemed to anticipate. She simply lowered her eyes again, and something quiet shifted inside her, like a door closing without sound. Whatever faith she had once held in leadership, in fairness, in the idea that strength meant protection, severed itself cleanly. If the Alpha King could look at her and see only a political inconvenience, then there was no place in Varen where she could afford to hope. The decree was finalized. The court dispersed with the satisfaction of people who believed they had restored order. Servants avoided her, guards escorted her, not harshly, but with the rigid distance reserved for contamination. She was given minimal provisions, a cloak, and directions that sounded like instructions for disposing of a problem rather than guiding a living person. Lyra left at dusk. The gates of Varen opened like a mouth releasing what it never wanted to swallow. Cold air rushed in from the borderlands, carrying the scent of pine, frost, and wild distances. Beyond the walls lay territory claimed only in maps, a place where patrols were rare and danger hid in quiet spaces. She walked forward without turning back, because turning back would mean she still expected something from them. She refused to give them that satisfaction. As the court vanished behind her, the world widened into silence. Her footsteps pressed into thin snow. Her breath came out in pale clouds. For a brief moment, she let herself feel the weight of what had happened, not as a tragedy but as a truth. She was alone now, and loneliness was not the worst thing. The worst thing had been kneeling in a hall full of wolves and realizing none of them saw her as worth defending. The borderlands did not welcome her, but they did not judge her either. That honesty felt sharp and almost cleansing. She kept moving, guided by instinct more than direction, and somewhere beneath her calm expression, her wolf stirred, not frightened, not defeated, but awake in a way it had not been inside the court's suffocating rules. She did not notice the first shadow that followed her at a distance. She did not hear the soft crunch of steps that matched her pace too perfectly. She only sensed, hours later, that the night felt crowded despite the open wilderness, as if unseen attention pressed against the edges of her awareness. She tightened her cloak, kept her posture steady, and continued forward as if she belonged to the dark as much as anyone else. Behind her, beyond the reach of the court's torches, eyes tracked her path with patient purpose, and the borderlands held their breath as if waiting for the moment her exile became something else entirely. The borderlands did not care that Lyra Ashen had once lived under a vaulted throne and rule-bound laws. Out here, the world measured worth in quieter currencies, warmth, timing, and the ability to read danger before it announced itself. The ground turned from stone-hard paths into uneven ridges where wind cut through fabric like judgment. Nights arrived early, colder than she expected, and the silence carried its own kind of threat, the kind that made even small sounds feel like mistakes. She learned quickly that loneliness was not an absence of life, it was the presence of everything that could watch her without being seen. She moved with discipline, not because anyone commanded it, but because survival demanded it. Lyra followed animal trails instead of roads, avoided the open stretches where human hunters sometimes traveled, and slept in places where her scent would be carried away rather than trapped. She rationed her provisions carefully, stretching each piece of dried food longer than it deserved, and forced herself to drink even when pride told her to endure thirst. Every choice felt like a negotiation with the wilderness, and she understood that one careless decision could turn exile into disappearance. Yet the strangest part of her new life was not the hunger or the cold. It was the steady pulse inside her, the presence she had spent years muting beneath obedience. Her wolf did not speak in words, and it did not beg her to return to what was familiar. It pressed against her awareness like a hand against a door, not frantic, not fearful, simply insistent. It made her pause when the air shifted. It guided her feet away from places that looked safe but smelled wrong. It urged her to look up at the tree line when she would have kept walking, and it left a tight warning in her ribs whenever she drifted too close to human territory. The Lyra had always been told an Omega's wolf was timid, built to submit, shaped to endure. What lived in her was nothing like that story. This wolf was controlled, patient, and strangely proud, as if it had been waiting for a world wide enough to breathe in. When Lyra's exhaustion tempted her to settle in the first sheltered hollow she found, the wolf pushed her onward until she discovered a higher ledge where smoke from distant camps could not easily reach. When she hesitated at a narrow ravine, uncertain if the frozen stream below was safe to cross, the wolf sent a calm certainty through her muscles, and she found the firm stones without slipping. It was not magic the way court tales described it. It was something more unnerving, competence that felt older than her own memories. Small victories followed, quiet and undeniable. She learned to make a fire that would not announce itself across miles, and she learned to put it out with no trace. She discovered edible roots beneath crusted soil, found a spring hidden behind a curtain of ice, and memorized the patterns of the wind the way the court used to memorize etiquette. Once, a pair of rogue wolves shadowed her for nearly an hour, staying just far enough away to pretend it was coincidence. Lyra did not run. She altered her path calmly, led them toward a narrow pass where the rocks forced distance, and then doubled back when their impatience pushed them forward. By the time they realized they had lost her, she was already gone, leaving nothing behind but footprints that blended into older tracks. The more she survived, the less she felt like the title that had been branded on her. Omega had been a cage and barren, a word used to shrink her until she fit into someone else's comfort. Out here, she was simply Lyra, a woman learning the shape of her own instincts. That realization did not come with joy. It came with something sharper, a controlled anger that kept her moving. The court had not thrown her out because she was weak. They had thrown her out because she made them uneasy, and unease was the one thing their hierarchy could not tolerate. Far away, the High Court of Varan continued to pretend it had corrected an imperfection. King Rivenvale held councils beneath carved pillars, listened to territorial reports, and tightened the borders with quiet authority. He increased patrol rotations, negotiated uneasy agreements with neighboring packs, and took a firmer stance in disputes that once might have been solved through compromise. His nobles praised his decisiveness. His elders called him vigilant. The court liked him best when he was most unfeeling, and Riven gave them what they wanted because a kingdom could not afford softness when enemies watched from beyond the mountains. But at night, when the hall emptied and the torches burned lower, doubt crept into the edges of his control like cold air through stone cracks. Not doubt about exile itself, he told himself. Doubt about the reason it had felt necessary. He remembered Lyra's gaze in that final moment, steady, unreadable, almost sorrowless. He had expected fear. He had expected pleading. Instead, he had seen something that looked dangerously like acceptance, and acceptance had unsettled him more than defiance would have. It suggested she had already stopped expecting justice from him, and a king who lost the faith of the powerless created a kind of weakness no army could patch. He buried the thought under duty, but the body kept its own record of what the mind denied. Sometimes, in the middle of strategy meetings, he felt a faint pull in his chest, a sensation like a distant storm shifting direction. It was brief, easy to dismiss, and yet it returned often enough to irritate him. He had lived through war and betrayal without superstition, but this felt like something beyond politics, like a thread stretched tight across distance. He never spoke of it. He simply clenched his jaw and made another decision that kept Varan standing. In the borderlands, Lyra felt that same thread in a different way. On certain nights, she woke from shallow sleep with her heartbeat too fast, as if someone far away had turned suddenly toward danger. She would sit up, listening, palm pressed to her sternum, and feel the wolf inside her become still and alert. It was not longing, it was not romance, it was awareness, sharp and inconvenient, as if her life remained connected to the court that had rejected her. She hated that connection on principle, yet she could not deny it existed. Some part of her still recognized the Alpha King's presence in the world like a distant thunder she could never fully escape. Days later, the wilderness tested that bond in a way Lyra could not outthink. The air shifted while she was crossing a low valley, carrying scents that did not belong together: metal, smoke, and unfamiliar wolves layered over human traces. The wind died abruptly, and the quiet turned heavy, as if the land itself was holding its breath. Lyra slowed, scanning the ridges, feeling her wolf rise closer to the surface with a warning that tightened her spine. She did not see an enemy, not clearly, but she felt the closing shape of one, intent, coordinated, confident that she was alone. A sound snapped through the stillness, not an impact but a signal, and movement broke across the slope like shadows stirred by a thrown stone. Lyra's body reacted before her mind could label what was happening. Her wolf surged upward, not in panic, but with a force so complete it stole her breath, and for the first time since exile began, Lyra felt the full truth of what had been sleeping inside her step forward and claim her skin. The High Court of Varan looked flawless from a distance, the kind of fortress that made rival territories hesitate before even considering a challenge. Its banners hung crisp, its halls stayed polished, its guards marched with synchronized precision that suggested certainty rather than strain. But King Rivenvale knew better than anyone that appearances were a weapon, and weapons dulled if they were not maintained. The court's strength was not simply in stone walls or trained soldiers, it was in the belief that those walls could never fall. As long as the world feared Varan, Varan remained safe. The moment fear faded, everything else would begin to unravel. Riven's days were shaped by pressure that never announced itself as panic. It arrived in controlled reports, in carefully phrased warnings, in nobles who smiled too much while asking questions that weren't really questions. Neighboring packs had grown restless, sensing opportunity in shifting borders and recent skirmishes. Trade routes were being tested, patrol lines probed, treaties reinterpreted with deliberate ambiguity. Rivals didn't need to declare hostility to be hostile, they only needed to create enough uncertainty that Varan had to spend its energy proving it was still dominant. A king who ruled by structure could not allow uncertainty to settle, because uncertainty invited negotiation, and negotiation invited the idea that Varan might be equal to others rather than above them. That was why Riven's authority depended on unyielding order. He did not cultivate affection, because affection could change with mood and rumor. He cultivated predictability, because predictability created obedience. The court moved like a machine around him, each rank fitting into place. When he issued a decree, it was followed not because his people loved him, but because they believed disobedience would be met with consequences. Fear kept the ambitious in line. Tradition kept the proud from questioning him openly. Even his allies respected him with a careful distance, as if getting too close might reveal that the man behind the crown was not invincible after all. He understood the cost of that kind of rule. A court held together by fear did not heal quickly. It did not forgive mistakes. It did not offer truth freely. Wolves hid weakness because weakness was punished, and hidden weakness became rot. Still, Riven chose the system because he believed softness was a luxury leaders could not afford. In his mind, mercy was not kindness, it was hesitation disguised as virtue. Mercy created gaps, and gaps were where enemies slipped in. Yet the court had begun to show signs that even his control could not smooth over. He saw it in the way certain guards avoided eye contact after patrol rotations, in the way messengers seemed relieved when they left his presence, in the way nobles whispered just a fraction longer before silencing themselves when he passed. He heard it in council discussions that ended too quickly, as if everyone feared speaking the wrong thought aloud. Morale had not collapsed, but it had shifted into something brittle, obedient, yes, but easily fractured if struck in the right place. The exile of the Omega had not caused this, he insisted to himself. That decision had been surgical, necessary, and clean. Still, the aftermath lingered in quiet ways. Omegas and lower-ranked wolves moved through the halls with even more caution than before, as if they had learned a new lesson about what safety truly meant. Some elders approved, calling it restored discipline. Riven noted the difference without comment, but the pattern irritated him. Fear was useful. Too much fear became silence. Silence became ignorance. Ignorance was a liability he could not tolerate. The real threat, however, was forming beyond the walls, and it had nothing to do with one banished Omega or court discomfort. It arrived through intelligence reports carried by scouts who traveled farther than most wolves dared. The first warnings were subtle: unusual movement along the eastern ridges, unfamiliar scents near disputed rivers, trading posts refusing to answer Varan's envoys. Then came the more alarming details: smaller packs aligning with a northern coalition, resources being redirected, messages passing between territories that had once been sworn enemies of each other. In isolation, each sign could be dismissed. Together, they formed a shape that Riven recognized with the cold certainty of experience. An alliance was forming. That was what made it dangerous. One rival pack could be deterred by strength. Two could be negotiated with. But an alliance meant strategy. It meant planning. It meant someone had decided Varren was either vulnerable or worth the risk. Riven laid the reports across his council table, mapping movement patterns, counting supply routes, identifying choke points where armies could pass. He listened to his generals argue over numbers and timing, then cut through the debate with precise directives. Patrols doubled. Border watchtowers were remanned. Scouts were sent farther, deeper, ordered to return with facts rather than speculation. He was brilliant at this part, the part where the world reduced itself to lines on a map and decisions that could save thousands. His mind was built for war before war began. He anticipated enemy logic, predicted where desperation would turn into aggression, and prepared contingencies that made his generals uneasy because they sounded too pessimistic. Riven did not call it pessimism. He called it survival. Overconfidence had killed more kings than Blades ever had. Still, his tactical brilliance carried a blind spot he rarely admitted even to himself. He measured strength in discipline and dominance. He trusted structured loyalty and dismissed the quieter forms of devotion that could not be demanded through rank. He believed that if every wolf obeyed, Varren would endure. He did not understand that obedience was not the same as unity, and unity was not forged by fear alone. He watched his court function and assumed function meant loyalty. He did not see the emotional fractures growing beneath the surface, the resentment that could become dangerous if an enemy offered the right temptation. In the council chamber, elders spoke of tradition as if tradition could repel armies. Noble houses demanded assurances that their bloodlines would be protected first, their lands fortified before others. Riven heard their selfishness and marked it as a threat as real as any enemy outside the walls. He gave them just enough to keep them from panicking, just enough to keep them from turning their anxiety into rebellion. But each concession left a taste of bitterness behind, because he knew they were not asking for Varren's survival. They were asking for their own. The court's imbalance sharpened when rumors began. Some whispered that Riven's harshness had finally provoked neighboring territories into alliance. Others whispered that Varren's leadership had become too rigid to adapt. A few dared to hint that the king had grown isolated, more commander than ruler, forgetting what it meant to bind wolves to him through something other than fear. Those whispers never reached him directly in clear accusation, but they drifted close enough that he could sense them like smoke. He responded the only way he knew, by tightening control. He expanded the guard's authority within the city walls. He limited travel permits. He called for mandatory readiness drills that disrupted daily life and irritated nobles who wanted stability, not preparation. Each act was rational. Each act was also a reminder that their king expected war, and expectation was contagious. The more he prepared, the more the court felt threatened, and the more threatened they felt, the more they looked for someone to blame. Riven did not care about blame. He cared about outcomes. But outcomes depended on wolves who could endure pressure without breaking. Late one evening, as the torches burned low and the council finally dispersed, Riven stood alone near the map table, eyes fixed on the borderlines. For a fleeting moment, that strange pull returned in his chest, faint but insistent, like a thread stretched tight across distance. He tried to dismiss it as exhaustion, but his instincts had never been so easily fooled. Something was shifting beyond his sight. Something was moving faster than his scouts. The doors opened with controlled urgency. A pair of scouts entered, their posture stiff, their scent sharp with cold travel and restrained alarm. They did not waste time with ceremony. They delivered their report with the careful precision of wolves who knew every word carried weight. The enemy alliance had finalized its movement. Forces were gathering at a pace that had been quiet for decades. Supplies were already staged. The timing was no longer uncertain. War was no longer a distant possibility. It was coming, and it was close enough that even the stone walls of Varren suddenly felt thinner than they had an hour before. War did not arrive at Varren like a storm on the horizon. It arrived like a door that had been quietly unlocked from the inside. One night the border watchfires burned in the usual rhythm, and by the next dawn the far sentry posts had gone silent, not with a single dramatic signal, but with the unnerving absence of one. Messengers rode hard with half-formed reports, each one contradicting the last in details but agreeing in the same core truth. Positions that had held for decades were folding in hours. The enemy alliance did not test Varren's strength with a single push. It slipped around it, struck where pride had left gaps, and turned familiar terrain into uncertainty. Rivenvale moved before the court could finish arguing about blame. He did not waste time on speeches meant to calm nobles who wanted reassurance more than reality. Orders snapped through the chain of command with cold clarity, and within hours the city's careful routines were replaced by coordinated urgency. Patrols that once marched for ceremony now moved for function. Supplies were redirected. The outer gates became arteries rather than symbols. Riven chose speed over comfort because speed was the only mercy war ever offered, and he could already feel the Alliance's intent like pressure against his borders, probing for the first crack that would become a rupture. The first real loss came with an insult that tasted like betrayal. A minor pack on the eastern ridge, long bound to Varen by oath and benefit, refused to open their pass to Riven's reinforcements. Their leader sent a message wrapped in polite language about neutrality, about protecting their own, about avoiding unnecessary escalation. Riven understood what it meant. The Alliance had promised them safety in exchange for distance, and the pack had chosen fear over loyalty. It was not a battlefield strike, yet it landed harder than one, because it proved what he had suspected. Obedience was fragile when it was not rooted in trust. Still, he rode out at the front of his forces, not to perform courage, but because he trusted his own instincts more than any report carried second-hand. He was the kind of alpha who made decisions with the map in his mind and the wind in his lungs, and the troops behind him drew steadiness from that. They did not cheer, they did not celebrate, they followed because his presence reduced chaos into direction. Even so, the closer they came to the contested valleys, the more the air felt wrong, too quiet in some places, too busy in others, full of scents that should not have laid together so neatly. The Alliance fought like a mind with many hands. Where Riven expected direct confrontation, he found misdirection. Where he anticipated a defensive line, he found empty ground that forced his forces to advance farther than planned. Signals that should have been reliable were delayed or distorted. Trusted lookouts returned shaken, certain they had seen friendly banners where no friendly banners should have been. The confusion was not accidental, it was designed to make Varen waste its strength chasing shapes that kept dissolving. Riven compensated quickly, rerouting units, tightening formations, refusing to be baited into reckless pursuit, but each correction cost time, and time was the one resource he could not replenish. Then the trap revealed itself without announcing the moment it had been set. A narrow route that should have offered safe passage for a strategic flank closed in on his forces from both sides, not with sudden impact, but with the realization that the terrain had become a cage. Smoke drifted from a ridge where no camp should have been. The ground underfoot held too many overlapping tracks, too recent, too intentional. Riven's generals urged retreat, but retreat required space, and space was exactly what the Alliance had taken away. The numbers surrounding them were not visible all at once, yet the weight of them pressed in from every direction, turning the valley into a problem that could not be solved by discipline alone. Riven pushed through with grim calculation, reshuffling commands, ordering his troops to prioritize escape routes over pride, insisting on cohesion when panic wanted to scatter them. But even the best strategy could not fully account for an enemy willing to sacrifice time and resources simply to corner him. His forces moved, and the Alliance moved with him, always just ahead, always tightening, always denying the clean resolution he needed. It felt like fighting the landscape itself, like every stone and shadow had been persuaded to oppose him. The curse was not supernatural, it was political, tactical, and deeply personal, the cost of being feared more than loved. Somewhere in that tightening chaos, the separation happened. Not because Riven lost control, but because the situation stopped offering any choice that didn't break something. He diverted attention to protect the core of his troops, drew pressure toward himself the way a lightning rod draws a storm, and bought him a corridor of movement that was narrower than it should have been. The decision worked, but it left him exposed to the one outcome a king cannot afford: isolation. One moment he was within reach of his guard, and the next the world between them filled with smoke, noise, and bodies in motion that did not belong to him. When he finally found a sliver of quiet behind a broken line of rocks, he realized how badly the day had turned against him. His breathing was too sharp, his balance slightly off, his senses dulled by exhaustion and something warmer than fatigue spreading beneath his armor. He tried to stand fully upright and felt the world tilt, as if the ground itself questioned his right to remain unshaken. The weight of his crown was not on his head, yet he felt it in his bones, heavy with every life that depended on his next choice. For the first time in years, he tasted the edge of helplessness. In that forced stillness, thoughts he had kept buried rose with unwelcome clarity. Pride told him he had done everything required. Regret asked whether required had been a convenient excuse for cruelty. He remembered Lyra Ashen kneeling in the great hall, the steadiness of her eyes, the way she had accepted exile without pleading as if she had already learned what kind of king he truly was. He had called it order. He had called it necessity. Now, with the court far away and his forces scattered, the memory returned like a quiet accusation that did not need words to cut. The light began to fade, not just because evening approached, but because his vision narrowed around the edges as his body demanded payment for everything he had pushed through. He pressed a hand to the ground, forcing himself to stay awake, forcing himself to listen for any sign of his wolves. There was only wind, distant movement, and the steady throb of his own pulse. Darkness gathered with patient certainty, and with it came the sense that something else was near, something not aligned with the alliance, not carrying the scent of his court either, something unfamiliar stepping into the ruin quiet as if it had been called there. Lyra did not decide to return to the war the way nobles decided to attend councils, with intention and ceremony. It happened the way instinct happened, sudden and undeniable, as if the world itself had tightened around a single thread and pulled. In the days after the Valley incident, she had tried to keep moving deeper into the borderlands, away from anything that smelled like Baron's politics or its pride. She told herself exile meant freedom from their chaos. She told herself that whatever fate the Alpha King earned belonged to him and his court, not to the Omega he discarded. But the bond did not accept her logic. It did not behave like memory or bitterness. It behaved like a living current, waking at odd hours, pressing sharp unease through her chest, dragging her attention toward the east even when the terrain begged her to turn west. At first she blamed the war's distant tremors, the way smoke could carry for miles. Then the pull sharpened into something more intimate, a pressure that made her throat tighten and her skin feel too small, as if her body recognized danger meant for someone else. The night she finally stopped resisting, she was crouched beneath a stand of firs with frost clinging to the needles. The air held a faint metallic tang that did not belong to the forest. Lyra closed her eyes and tried to breathe through it, to force the sensation away, but her wolf rose close behind her ribs with a calm insistence that felt like command. It did not demand submission. It demanded direction. It carried certainty that someone was failing somewhere beyond the ridges, someone tied to her by a link neither of them had chosen. She moved before dawn, not toward Varen's gates, but toward the scent of disruption. The closer she got, the more the world changed. Birds stayed quiet. Animals avoided the open. The snow held too many disturbed patches, footprints laid on footprints as if the land itself had been repeatedly interrupted. Lyra kept to shadowed paths, climbing ridges where she could see valleys without being seen, and each mile drew that thread tighter, turning unease into urgency. She found the edge of the battlefield without needing to see banners or bodies to understand what had happened. The air was wrong, thick with fear and smoke carried by shifting wind. The ground bore the scars of hurried movement, abandoned gear, broken branches, trampled snow that had turned grey in places where fires had burned too close. Voices drifted in fragments from far off, not screams, but sharp calls and the strained coordination of wolves trying to recover order after it had been broken. Lyra stayed outside the main chaos, circling, listening, letting her wolf take the lead in reading what her eyes could not. Then she felt him. It was not recognition like seeing a face. It was the sudden certainty of where the pull had been leading all along. Somewhere near a line of rocks where the terrain dipped, the bond snapped taut, and Lyra's breath caught as if her own lungs had been struck. The sensation was not romantic. It was not gentle. It was primal awareness, the kind that made her body react before her mind formed words. The Alpha King was there, alone enough that the world had begun to close over him. Resentment flared hot and immediate, the old memory of the throne room cutting through her like cold water. She remembered the decree, the hall full of satisfied faces, the way Riven's voice had framed exile as mercy. A part of her wanted to turn away, to let the bond burn out, to prove that his decisions had consequences he could not escape. Another part of her, quieter but more powerful, refused to let anyone's pride decide who lived and who died, even if the one in danger had once treated her like a problem to remove. Her wolf settled the conflict with a force that felt almost sacred. It rose fully, not as rage, but as clarity, and Lyra felt her senses sharpened beyond anything she had known inside court walls. Every scent separated into layers. Every shift of wind carried meaning. Her body moved with disciplined certainty, as if she had trained for this moment without ever realizing it. The wolf inside her was not frantic. It was controlled, deliberate, and terrifyingly effective in the way it assessed risk and chose the cleanest path through it. Lyra approached the rock line carefully, using the terrain to stay unseen. She did not rush. She did not need to. Her instincts guided her around open spaces where enemy scouts might still linger, and when she heard movement nearby, she waited without panic until it passed. The suspense of the battlefield was not in visible combat, it was in the tension of being hunted by attention. Here, a single misplaced sound could draw the wrong wolves. Lyra kept her breathing slow, her steps measured, and her focus locked on the one presence that felt like gravity. When she reached him, she saw how close the war had come to ending Varen's king. Riven lay half-supported against stone, his posture stubborn even in collapse, as if his body refused to admit what it was becoming. His scent was mixed with exhaustion and blood, and the sharpness of it made Lyra's stomach tighten. For a heartbeat she simply stared, surprised by the raw fact that a figure who seemed carved from authority could be reduced to something human and fragile. Then the bond surged again, not asking for permission, and Lyra moved. She did not announce herself. She did not speak his name. She worked with swift, quiet competence, pulling him into deeper cover where the wind would scatter their scent, tearing cloth to bind what needed binding, using snow and pressure to slow what threatened to drain him. Her hands were steady, not tender, because tenderness would have made her hesitate. She listened for movement, kept her body positioned between him and the open valley, and let her wolf watch the darkness with an intensity that made the shadows feel less certain of themselves. At one point, footsteps crunched somewhere too close, and Lyra's wolf surged again, flooding her veins with the kind of presence that made the air feel heavier. She did not attack. She did not need to. She shifted her stance, lifted her head, and released a low, controlled warning sound that was more vibration than threat, an unmistakable message carried by dominance rather than violence. The footsteps paused. The scent in the air wavered, uncertain, and then withdrew. Whoever had been searching decided not to investigate further, as if the wilderness itself had suddenly become unfriendly. Lyra exhaled slowly, anger and relief tangling together. She had saved him, and she hated that it felt inevitable. She hated that some part of her still responded to his existence as if it mattered. Yet she could not deny the other truth either. Leaving him to die would not have been justice. It would have been surrender to the cruelty that had shaped Varen in the first place. If she was ever going to become more than the title they gave her, she could not let bitterness be her ruler. When she was sure he would survive the next hour, she forced herself to step back. Staying would mean being seen. Being seen would mean being claimed by the court again, pulled into politics, turned into either a symbol of his mercy or a weapon his rivals could use. Lyra had no interest in becoming another piece on their board. She adjusted his position one last time, placed a strip of cloth where his hand could find it if he woke confused, and then she retreated into the dark with the same precision that had brought her in. By the time Varen's scouts finally traced the faint signs of where their king had vanished, the Omega was already gone, leaving behind only disturbed snow and unanswered questions. Riven drifted in and out of awareness, his mind catching fragments, cold air, the scent of pine, a presence that felt impossibly familiar and impossibly distant at once. When his eyes finally opened fully, he found himself alive in a world that should have ended him, and the first certainty that settled in his chest was as sharp as any blade. His life had been spared by the one he cast out. The realization did not arrive gently. It cracked something fundamental in him, not his pride alone, but the structure of belief he had built his rule upon. He had convinced himself he understood strength. He had convinced himself that power lived in rank, in bloodlines, in visible dominance. He had seen Lyra in the throne room and believed her quietness meant weakness. Now he was forced to confront the possibility that her quietness had been restraint, and that the court's hierarchy had not contained weakness at all, but blindness. If an Omega could move through his war-torn valley unseen, outthink both enemy scouts and his own guard lines, and leave him alive without claiming credit, then his entire system of judgment had been flawed. That flaw was not merely personal. It was political, and politics in wartime was as lethal as any external enemy. Word of his injury spread despite his efforts to control it. Rivals within the court began circling, not openly, but with questions that carried teeth. They asked whether he had misjudged the alliance's strength. They asked whether his rigid policies had pushed neutral pacts into enemy arms. They asked whether Varen needed a leader who could inspire loyalty, not just enforce obedience. Allied territories sent cautious messages of support that read like tests, gauging whether the king they had relied on was still capable of protecting their agreements. Even some generals began shifting their posture subtly, positioning themselves closer to influence as if preparing for a future where Riven might not remain unchallenged. Riven recognized the danger immediately. The alliance was outside his walls, but fracture was inside them. A court under strain did not need a coup to fall apart, it only needed doubt to spread faster than hope. He could not afford to appear shaken, yet the truth he carried was shaking him. Not because he feared Lyra's power, but because he feared what his own decision revealed about him. He had mistaken control for leadership. He had mistaken fear for stability. He had called exile mercy, when in reality it had been convenience. For the first time, he considered accountability not as a public performance, but as a necessary correction. He could not undo the decree with a speech. He could not repair a wound he had inflicted with a proclamation. If Lyra had survived exile and returned to save him, then the least he owed her was recognition of her agency and an end to the court's right to define her as disposable. Yet that thought brought its own complications. A king acknowledging he had been wrong was not simply a personal act. It was a shift in power, and shifts in power invited predators. So he chose a middle path that was dangerous in its own way. He did not announce a change. He did not call Lyra's name in council. He issued a quiet order instead, delivered only to the few he trusted with hard truths. They were to find the Omega who had intervened. Not to punish her, not to drag her back in chains. They were to bring her to him safely, with discretion, because her existence had become a strategic necessity. A wolf with that kind of skill, that kind of hidden strength, could change the balance of a war that was already trying to choke Varen from the edges. Even as he gave the order, he felt the weight of what it implied. He was no longer seeking control of a problem. He was seeking a person he had failed, and he did not know if she would answer anything he offered. That uncertainty was new to him, and it forced humility in a way no council argument ever had. He realized that if he found her, he could not treat her like a piece to be repositioned. If he did, he would only prove that exile had taught her the correct lesson about him. The scouts left at dusk, and Riven returned to the maps, forcing his body to endure the pain of sitting upright, forcing his mind to stay sharp. Hours later, they returned with the first real sign that Lyra had not simply vanished into wilderness. Tracks had been found near a ravaged supply path, too controlled to belong to a rogue wolf and too light to belong to a full patrol. The trail cut toward the edge of enemy territory, where the Alliance's presence thickened and where any mistake would become captivity. Riven stared at the marks in the dirt, recognizing in them the same disciplined precision that had saved his life, and he understood the cliff he now stood at. Following those tracks meant walking straight into danger, but letting them fade meant losing the one truth that had finally forced him to see. Lyra never intended to become part of anyone's war. After leaving Riven alive behind those rocks, she tried to disappear again, deeper into the borderlands where no banner could claim her and no council could rewrite her choices into propaganda. But the land did not allow clean separation anymore. The Alliance's reach had spread like a stain, seeping into valleys that used to belong to wandering herds and quiet border packs. Roads that had once carried traders now carried guarded caravans. Fires burned in places that should have remained untouched. And everywhere Lyra traveled, she found signs of the same pattern, smaller packs being squeezed between armies, forced to choose sides they did not understand, punished when they hesitated. She could have kept walking and called it survival. She had earned that right. Yet every time she passed a hidden den or caught the scent of frightened pups carried on the wind, something in her wolf tightened with a cold, relentless focus. It was not noble idealism. It was instinct, a refusal to tolerate predators closing in on the vulnerable simply because the powerful had decided the borderlands were expendable. Lyra began intervening in small ways at first, the kind that left no signature. She redirected foot traffic by collapsing a narrow path with loosened stones. She scattered strong-smelling herbs across a trail to confuse tracking parties. She watched supply movements from ridges and memorized their rhythm until she could anticipate where the next weakness would appear. Then the sabotage became deliberate. Enemy caravans relied on certainty. They needed predictable routes, reliable caches, clean communication between scouts and commanders. Lyra made none of those things safe. She did not attack openly and she did not seek a fight. She broke patterns instead. She cut harness straps in the night so a pack's wagons would fail miles from where they expected. She released penned animals so noise and chaos would slow a column long enough for border packs to slip away unnoticed. She left misleading signs at river crossings, prints that suggested a larger force had moved through, scent trails that pulled enemy scouts in the wrong direction. The Alliance began losing time, and in war, time was bloodless currency that still decided who suffered first. Each success came with a cost. The more Lyra pushed her wolf to the surface, the more the wolf demanded more space in return. The transformation was not just physical, it was a reshaping of her senses, her instincts, and the boundaries of her self-control. When she drew too deeply on that power, the world became too loud, too sharp, full of temptations to solve every problem with dominance rather than thought. She had to constantly pull herself back from the edge of becoming only instinct. After nights of intense focus, her body would shake with fatigue she could not explain, as if her bones had been stretched and reset. She would wake sore, her hands stiff, her mind threaded with strange dreams that felt like memories belonging to a wolf older than her own life. There were moments she wondered if the court had sensed this and exiled her out of fear, not embarrassment. The idea brought bitter amusement. They had called her Omega as if it made her harmless, when in truth the title had been the only thing keeping her contained. Out here, nothing contained her except her own discipline, and discipline was fraying under repeated strain. The turning point came when she encountered a border pack camped in the hollow of a ruined grove, their shelters hastily built, their scent full of fear and exhaustion. They were not warriors. They were families, elders, and young wolves who had fled deeper lands after the Alliance began demanding tribute. Their leader recognized Lyra's rank by instinct and still bowed, not out of respect, but out of desperation. They spoke of an enemy commander who had set up a controlling post near the ridge pass, cutting off movement and forcing border packs to either submit or starve. The commander did not need to slaughter anyone to win. He only needed to tighten the noose until surrender felt like the only option. Lyra listened in silence, anger rising in a slow, controlled burn. This was the kind of cruelty that hid behind strategy and called itself efficiency. It reminded her too much of Varen's court, of decisions framed as necessity while lives were treated as expendable. She realized then that if she kept sabotaging caravans, the Alliance would adapt. They would change routes, increase guards, punish nearby packs in retaliation, and eventually the border families would pay the price for every delay she caused. The only way to protect these innocents was to cut out the pressure point, the commander whose presence turned the ridge pass into a chokehold. She went alone because bringing others would mark them. It would give the Alliance a target and justify retaliation. Alone, she could vanish again if she failed. Alone, she could absorb the consequences without dragging a pack into her shadow. The decision felt like exile all over again, except this time it was her choice, and that difference mattered enough to steady her hands. She approached the ridge pass at night, watching from a high ledge where she could see the commander's post below. It was a controlled operation, organized supply stacks, orderly patrol rotations, scouts moving like they believed the land belonged to them. That confidence irritated her more than the guards did. It meant they had not yet learned to fear the borderlands. It meant they thought the wilderness would obey the strongest banner. Lyra stayed still for a long time, letting her wolf map the flow of scent and sound, identifying where attention weakened, where arrogance created blind spots. When she finally moved, it was with the disciplined precision that had saved Riven. She slipped between patrol routes, avoided direct lines of sight, and used wind shifts like cover. Her goal was not to kill anyone. Her goal was to break the post's control. She targeted their communication first, severing the link between scouts and the command tent by misplacing signal markers and scattering scents that would make messages unreliable. Then she created confusion within the supply arrangement, loosening key ties and shifting crates so that inventory would not match records by morning. A commander could handle an ambush. A commander could not easily handle the slow unraveling of certainty. Eventually, she drew close enough to the heart of the post to sense him, an alpha-level presence, sharp with confidence, surrounded by wolves who mirrored his arrogance. The enemy commander was not just a strategist, he was a symbol. Border packs feared him because he made suffering feel inevitable. Lyra let her wolf rise fully then, not in rage, but in controlled dominance that pressed against the air like a storm front. She did not reveal herself in the open. She made her presence felt in the edges of perception, a pressure that unsettled guards and made their formation tighten for no visible reason. The commander came out, drawn by instinct, searching the dark as if he could force the night to explain itself. Lyra held that moment like a blade. She did not step forward to challenge him with speech. She challenged him with certainty. She moved just enough for him to see a shadow that did not retreat, a figure that did not flinch. And when his guards shifted, confused by the heavy dominance pressing into their senses, Lyra used the distraction to push deeper into the post and complete what she came to do. She triggered a controlled collapse of their supply staging by cutting key supports so the stacks toppled into disarray, ruining their efficiency without harming the wolves around them. The effect was immediate. Orders snapped through the camp. Patrol routes broke. The commander's attention fractured between restoring control and hunting the source of humiliation. Lyra retreated into the outer dark, but the strain of holding her wolf at full emergence hit her like delayed thunder. Her breath turned ragged, her vision sharpened too hard, edges of the world slicing into her mind. Her limbs felt heavy, as if the transformation had demanded a debt her body could not afford. She made it beyond the first ridge line before her knees threatened to fold. Pride urged her to keep running, but her wolf pressed exhaustion into her muscles like a warning. She stumbled behind a cluster of rocks, forcing herself to stay quiet even as her pulse roared in her ears. Sweat cooled instantly against her skin. Every inhale felt like dragging air through frost. The power that had made her unstoppable for a short time was now draining her, leaving her vulnerable in the worst possible place. Lyra tried to stand again and failed, her body trembling with the aftershock of holding that dominance too long. She clenched her jaw, refusing panic, but her senses caught the sound she did not want to hear, organized footsteps, multiple sets, spreading outward in a tightening search pattern. The enemy had adapted faster than she expected. She pressed herself deeper into shadow, fighting to keep her breathing silent, knowing she had pushed her wolf to its limit and that her next transformation, if she needed it, might break something in her that would not mend. As her strength bled away into the cold ground, the searchline drew closer, and the night around her filled with approaching scents that promised she would not be given time to recover. Lyra's vision swam in and out of sharp focus as the searchline tightened around the ridge. She lay pressed into the cold shadow of stone, forcing her breathing into shallow control, listening to the way disciplined footsteps spread like a net. The enemy commander's wolves were not frantic. They were practiced, confident that fatigue would finish what vigilance had begun. Lyra's wolf stirred inside her, still powerful, still present, but held back by the brutal truth of her body's limits. She could feel the aftershock of her last emergence in every joint, every tendon, as if her bones had been rewired and left raw. She understood, with cold clarity, that if she tried to rise into that power again too soon, she might win the moment and lose herself permanently. A faint shift of wind carried another scent into the ravine, familiar and impossible at once. It came in clean, cold lines, layered with steel and winter, the unmistakable signature of Varen's alphaking. Lyra's first reaction was disbelief, followed instantly by anger so sharp it steadied her heart. He should not be here. He had a war to lead, a court to hold together, and 1,000 reasons to never step into the borderlands in pursuit of the Omega he exiled. Yet the bond she had tried to deny sparked like a nerve, confirming what her senses already knew. Rivenvale had followed her trail into enemy territory. He arrived without banner or spectacle, moving through the dark with a small unit of elite scouts, each one silent enough to be mistaken for the wilderness itself. Riven did not call out to her. He did not announce authority. He assessed the ridge, read the search pattern, and made a decision with the same tactical precision he used at a war table. His eyes swept the rocks and shadows until they landed on the one place that held a stillness too deliberate to be natural. When his gaze met hers, Lyra felt the jolt of recognition like a strike of lightning through both pride and fear. He looked older than she remembered, not in age but in weight, as if the last days had carved away whatever softness he once had and left only purpose. Yet there was something else in his expression now, something she had never seen in the throne room, a hard honesty and a quiet urgency that did not ask her to kneel. He signaled his scouts to create a diversion farther up the ridge, not with noise or violence, but with misdirection. A few controlled movements in the open, a brief shift of shadow where it should not have been, enough to pull enemy attention just slightly off its tightening path. The searchline paused, recalibrated, and began drifting toward the new point of suspicion. In that fraction of opportunity, Riven crossed the distance to Lyra with restrained speed and dropped into cover beside her without shaking the stones. Up close, the reversal felt unreal. The Alpha King, who had once sentenced her to the borderlands like a correction, was now crouched in the same dirt and cold, making himself smaller to shield her from being seen. Lyra wanted to shove him away, to remind him of the decree, to spit out every silent insult she had swallowed in Varen's hall. But her body betrayed her fury, trembling with exhaustion, and she hated that he noticed. His attention flicked to her shaking hands, the pallor in her face, the way she fought for steadiness. He did not touch her immediately. He simply placed his own cloak closer, creating a barrier against wind and scent, and angled his body so the enemy's line of sight would have to pass through him first. The moment stretched with danger. Enemy scouts moved nearer again, adjusting their search, suspicious of how the trail had abruptly thinned. Lyra felt her wolf tense, hungry to rise, but the cost of forcing it again threatened to crush her. Riven seemed to understand without her needing to explain. He made a choice then that had nothing to do with dominance and everything to do with protection. He shifted position deliberately, letting his scent carry just enough to draw the enemy's instincts. It was a calculated risk, using his own identity as bait, because an Alpha King's presence could not be ignored. The enemy line hesitated, attention snapping toward him, unsure whether they had just found a prize too valuable to be real. Riven rose partially from cover, not charging, not provoking, simply revealing himself enough to command the space with presence alone. His voice, when it cut through the night, was low and controlled, carrying authority without shouting. It did not threaten, it did not plead, it offered one clean truth: the borderlands were not theirs to harvest, and their commander's grip on this pass was about to break. The enemy scouts froze, caught between the instinct to obey a dominant alpha and the loyalty they owed their alliance. That hesitation was the opening Riven needed. He stepped back into shadow again, pulling Lyra with him, guiding her toward a narrow cut in the rocks that his scouts had already mapped as an escape route. Lyra stumbled once, her knees threatening to fold, and Riven's hand caught her elbow with firm steadiness. The contact was brief but loaded. It was not tenderness. It was support given without permission, support that assumed she mattered. That assumption infuriated her almost as much as it unsettled her, because it was the first time he had ever behaved as if her life held weight equal to his own. She wanted to reject it, but the alternative was collapse in the open, and she refused to die to prove a point. They moved fast and quiet, slipping through the cut as the enemy's search pattern wavered. Behind them, one of Riven's scouts deliberately revealed a false trail leading toward a steep descent, drawing several enemy wolves after it. The Alliance's discipline kept them from fully fracturing, but the delay was enough. Lyra's senses dulled with each step, exhaustion pulling at her vision like fog. She could hear distant voices calling orders, the enemy commander's authority sharpening the night, but she could also hear something else now, Varen's wolves responding to Riven's presence, gathering closer, tightening their own formation with renewed certainty. And then the moment happened that neither secrecy nor strategy could prevent. As they reached a ridge that overlooked the pass, Allied border pack members emerged from hiding, drawn by the diversion and the chance to flee. Some recognized Riven instantly and dropped into stunned stillness. Others saw Lyra beside him, cloaked and unsteady, and the confusion hit like a shockwave. Enemy scouts on the lower slope caught sight of them as well, and in the pale, exposed light, Lyra's restrained power flared through her scent despite her exhaustion. It was unmistakable, an Omega by title, but not by nature. A wolf carrying dominance that did not fit the court's rules. Whispers spread before anyone could stop them. Varen's king was protecting an Omega. The Omega was not helpless. The Omega was the same presence that had been unraveling supply lines, breaking the Alliance's certainty, humiliating their commander without spilling blood. Allies stared with dawning realization. Enemies stared with alarm. The border pack stared with something like hope, because hope was rare out here and dangerous to trust. Riven did not retreat from their attention. He turned to face it, and in that instant, Lyra saw the shape of the decision he was making before he spoke it. He could have claimed she was a tool, an asset captured and controlled, something the court could accept without changing its beliefs. He could have ordered her restrained to prove authority. He could have pretended she did not matter and erased her again for the sake of stability. Instead, he placed himself slightly in front of her, not hiding her, but aligning with her. His voice carried across the ridge with calm finality. He identified her by name, Lyra Ashen, and in doing so he shattered the court's convenient fiction that she had been a disposable mistake. He declared her under his protection, not as property, not as punishment, but as a rightful wolf of Varen whose strength had saved lives and whose exile had been wrong. The words hit the air like a blade through old laws. Tradition did not allow an alpha king to admit fault publicly, especially not in war. Court law did not permit an Omega to be elevated into strategic importance. Yet Riven spoke as if the law had always been the lesser thing compared to the duty of a king. Lyra's resentment surged, because protection from him felt too much like ownership, too close to the same control he had once wielded. But as she watched the faces around them change, some hardening, some softening, some shocked into silence, she understood what he was truly risking. This was not a performance to win her loyalty. It was a move that would split Varen's court, because many would rather lose the war than change the hierarchy that made them comfortable. The fallout began immediately. A noble-born captain stepped forward, fury tightening his posture, demanding to know why the king would endanger tradition for an Omega. Another wolf, a border leader, answered with quiet bitterness about who had been protecting families while the court debated pride. The conflict sparked like dry tinder, not into violence, but into sharp, dangerous division. Riven held the line with presence alone, refusing to retreat, refusing to soften his declaration, forcing everyone to confront the new reality. Leadership was not control, it was responsibility, and responsibility sometimes required breaking the rules that kept injustice intact. As Lyra leaned against the rock, fighting to stay upright, she felt the cliff edge of the future beneath them. Riven's choice had changed the court, whether the court accepted it or not. The Alliance would respond, tightening its grip, angered by disruption and embarrassed by the cracks now visible in Varen's hierarchy. And inside Varen itself, the divide would deepen, those who saw Lyra as proof of a stronger future and those who saw her as the enemy within. In the distance, beyond the ridge, horns sounded, signals of regrouping, not retreat. The final battle was no longer a looming concept. It was forming, gathering, deciding what kind of kingdom would remain when the smoke cleared, and whether Lyra would be allowed to stand in it or be crushed by it. The final confrontation did not begin with a dramatic charge or a roar of triumph. It began with decision, the kind made in tight circles around rough maps while wind rattled canvas and distant signals echoed through the mountains. The enemy alliance had regrouped near the ridge pass, convinced that Varen's internal fracture would do half their work for them. They expected hesitation, infighting, and the slow collapse that came when a kingdom stopped believing in itself. What they did not anticipate was the kind of unity that could form when fear no longer dictated the terms of loyalty. Rivenvale and Lyra Ashen stood at the center of that new alignment, not as a king and an omega, but as two forces finally compelled to recognize each other's truth. Riven brought structure, command, and the clarity of a strategist who could see 3 moves ahead. Lyra brought instinct, unconventional insight, and the ability to move through uncertainty without being trapped by it. The combined effect shifted the atmosphere among Varen's wolves. Those who had wavered began to settle, not because tradition demanded it, but because the plan in front of them was grounded in reality rather than pride. Border packs, once dismissed as expendable, were given meaningful roles as scouts and guides because they knew the terrain better than anyone. Even noble-born captains who had resisted Lyra's presence could not ignore the way their lines tightened when she was included rather than hidden. The strategy they chose was built on coordination rather than brute force. Riven refused to feed his wolves into a narrow pass where the Alliance could overwhelm them with numbers. Lyra refused to let him treat the borderlands like an empty board where pieces could be sacrificed without consequence. Together they shaped a plan that used the land's natural choke points to isolate the Alliance's command structure, sever communication, and force the enemy into confusion without turning the battlefield into a slaughter. Wolves were positioned not just to fight, but to redirect, mislead, and contain. Supply routes were targeted with precision so the Alliance's confidence would erode from the inside. The goal was not to crush the enemy through brutality. The goal was to remove their ability to coordinate, because an alliance without coordination was not an alliance, only a collection of wolves suddenly aware they were far from home. In the hours before the confrontation, Lyra felt the strain of her wolf pushing against her skin again, eager for the space it needed to move freely. The difference now was that she was not alone in resisting the dangerous pull of overreach. Riven's presence, steady and controlled, anchored her in a way she did not want to admit. The bond between them, once a curse she tried to outrun, began to behave like balance. When her instincts rose too sharply toward dominance, his calm discipline tempered it. When his need for control tightened into rigidity, her fluid adaptability softened it into something that could breathe. It was not romance in the fragile sense. It was partnership forged under pressure, built from a recognition that each of them carried what the other lacked. Riven, for his part, felt his own wolf settle in a way it never had while ruling through fear. For years, his dominance had been a weapon he wielded to enforce order. Now it became something else, a signal of protection that did not require humiliation to be effective. Standing beside Lyra forced him to confront the truth that authority could be shared without being weakened. The realization did not make him softer. It made him clearer. He began to understand that loyalty earned through trust lasted longer than loyalty extracted through intimidation, and that a kingdom could endure pressure if its wolves believed they belonged to something worth defending. When the confrontation unfolded, it was tense, precise, and constantly shifting rather than chaotic. The enemy alliance moved with confidence at first, expecting Varen's lines to meet them in predictable formation. Instead, they found emptiness where they anticipated resistance and resistance where they expected passage. Their scouts reported conflicting information, their messengers struggled to deliver clear instructions, and their commanders began issuing orders that overlapped and contradicted. Varen's wolves held the ground without chasing glory. Border scouts guided them through concealed routes, allowing units to appear where the alliance least expected. Lyra's presence moved like a quiet storm through the edges of the conflict, not striking for spectacle, but applying pressure exactly where it disrupted the enemy's cohesion. At one critical point, the Alliance attempted to bait Riven into overcommitting, presenting what looked like a weakness in their center. Riven would have taken that bait in the past, because dominance demanded decisive victory. This time he did not. He glanced toward Lyra, not for permission, but for confirmation of instinct, and the bond between them carried an unspoken warning. They held back, allowing the Alliance's maneuver to exhaust itself, then redirected their forces to cut off the enemy commander's access to the ridge pass. The enemy's confidence cracked, and with that crack came the first real shift in momentum. Alliance wolves began questioning whether their leaders had miscalculated, whether the promises of an easy conquest had been lies. Victory came in layers rather than a single climactic moment. It came when the Alliance's supply support faltered and their hunger sharpened impatience. It came when isolated units realized no reinforcements were coming because communication had been severed. It came when smaller packs within the Alliance, never fully committed, saw an opening to withdraw rather than be trapped in another territory's war. It came, most importantly, when Varen's wolves stopped fighting as ranked fragments and started moving as a unified force. Trust did not erase fear, but it gave fear direction. Sacrifice still existed, but it was chosen strategically, not imposed casually on the powerless. When the alliance finally broke its formation and began retreating from the pass, the relief that spread through Varen's forces was cautious, almost disbelieving. Riven did not chase them into the mountains. He secured the borders, reclaimed the contested routes, and ensured the vulnerable border packs had space to breathe again. Lyra, drained but standing, watched the aftermath with a strange quiet in her chest. She had fought for a kingdom that had once rejected her, and now that kingdom was looking back at her with new eyes. Some still carried resentment, some carried awe, many carried confusion, but none could pretend she was nothing. The rebuilding began immediately, and it was more difficult than war in its own way. Nobles who had survived the conflict tried to reassert the old hierarchy as if the last weeks had been an inconvenience rather than a reckoning. Elders argued that tradition had held Varen together, refusing to admit tradition had nearly split it. Border packs demanded representation, no longer willing to be treated as disposable buffers. Omegas, emboldened by Lyra's visibility, began stepping out of enforced silence, insisting they were wolves of Varen, not burdens to hide. The court's division did not vanish with the alliance's retreat. It hardened into political conflict that required a different kind of leadership to resolve. Riven chose transformation rather than denial. He convened a council not to restore old rules, but to rewrite them. Rank would remain, but it would no longer define a wolf's right to safety or dignity. Omegas would no longer be treated as shame, but as citizens with protections and voice. Border territories would be integrated into the court's strategic planning instead of being used as sacrifice zones. These changes did not happen without resistance. Some nobles threatened to withdraw support. Some elders warned that loosening hierarchy would invite chaos. Riven listened to them with the same calm authority he once used to enforce their comfort, then reminded them that Varen had survived not because tradition was flawless, but because it finally adapted. Lyra did not ask for a throne, yet she did not step away either. She demanded accountability in the only way she knew how, by refusing to let the court pretend it could return to what it had been. Her presence became a standard the kingdom could not ignore. She worked with border leaders to map new patrol systems that protected families rather than only trade routes. She pushed for training structures that recognized skill and service alongside bloodline. And in quiet moments, when exhaustion softened her defenses, she allowed herself to acknowledge that the bond she had resented had also given her a path back into power on her own terms. In the Great Hall of Varen, under the same black stone pillars that once made her feel invisible, Riven faced the court and made his final choice public. He did not call her Omega. He called her Lyra Ashen, and he named her as his equal in duty and in rule, not as ornament and not as symbol, but as partner in the kingdom's future. The declaration did not erase every prejudice in the room, but it shifted the ground beneath them. Wolves who had clung to the old order realized the king they feared had become a king who would protect, and that protection had conditions. The kingdom would evolve or it would fracture itself. As peace settled into the borders, it did not feel like a perfect ending. It felt like the first steady breath after nearly drowning. The rebuilt patrol lines held. The border packs returned to their lands with cautious hope. The court's debates continued, but now they were debates shaped by survival rather than vanity. And on a quiet night when the torches burned low and snow fell softly beyond the walls, a distant howl rose from the far wilderness, neither hostile nor familiar, carrying a message that the world beyond Varen was still moving, still watching, and that whatever they had rebuilt would soon be tested again. G's Kingdom Neusa y Kamzor Samaj H Kar Thukra Diatar, Wahi Kingdom Uski Waja Shay Zindaraha. Alphaking Ne Samaj H Liaki Asli Takar Hukem Deen Mine Nahi, Zimadari Athane Mine Hoti Hai. Omega G's Karbi Nazar Andaz Kia Gaia, Abfaislon Kar Hissa Thi, Sayanahi. Undono Kar Bon Takdir Kar Majbor Rishta Nahi Raha, Balkaek Conscious Choice Bangaya. Kort Ki Kanun Badli, Lekan Sab Shay Zayada Dil Badli. Aya Jab Aman Laut Aya, To Yer Srs Bhi Sath Aya, Kikuch Kahanin Jang Par Katam Nahi Hoti, Balke Wahan Shay Shuru Hoti Hain Jahan Sab Kuch Tu Chukahota Hai. If this story made you feel the shift between power and destiny, pass it to someone who understands stories that stay with you. More worlds like this are already unfolding, shaped by loyalty, sacrifice, and choices that change everything. Stay close to this journey, because the next story won't wait for permission to pull you in. And before you go, where in the world are you watching this from right now?